Hello and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch, and today I'm going to talk about books I want to read for the Gothlit November readathon, I guess you call it. I don't know. Event. Enthusiasm. So Rachel at Second Thoughts About the Mission and Bailey at what used to be the Bailey Grind and is now Bailey Jean, I believe. On YouTube, I'll link them below. Have put up their announcement videos, which I'll also link below. And they host this, I guess, readathon, let's say, where it's just all about reading whatever Gothic-inspired, Gothic-ish books you want to read in November. Because, you know, October does all the horror stuff, and November is just sort of, I don't know. It's not very, there's not a lot to be enthusiastic about weather-wise, because it's definitely winter where I live at that point. And it's just a bit of fun. So beyond that, there aren't really any rules as far as I know. In their videos they talk about 4 categories. So they break it out into the classics, Victorian, Southern, and contemporary. And most of the ones I'm going to talk about fit either into contemporary or Victorian. A couple are like Southern, but some are American from the same period as the Southern Gothic, but not in the Southern Gothic, so they don't quite fit into that, so let's just call it contemporary, I guess, contemporary-ish. Contemporary is going to do a lot of heavy lifting in this TBR video. So I've also put them all on a Goodreads bookshelf that I'm going to list below. They're like 47 at last count, I think, so clearly it is not possible for me to read them all in November. That's not going to be a thing that happens, which is fine. I am aware that that is impossible. However, I'm going to give it a good go and see how many I get through, and whichever ones I don't finish, I'll either read in December if I feel like reading them in December, or hold them over for next year, or whatever, something. I'll do a thing. It'll be fine. So the first sort of, I've got a few subcategories just for the sake of my own organization and keeping myself from getting overwhelmed by my own reading list, because it is a tiny bit ridiculous. So one of the categories that would fall within contemporary, in the contemporary Gothic fiction sort of broad umbrella, is Res Gothic or Indigenous Gothic. So there are a few books by Indigenous authors that have Gothic elements, at the very least, or are outright Gothic. And so one of the ones I want to read that's been on my list for a while, which I didn't actually realize was considered so Gothic, is Monkey Beach. Now, in Canada, and we can get into this a little bit maybe later, but I've read a couple of books on Canadian Gothic, because that's where I'm from. So sometimes that resonates a bit more than American or British Gothic. But sometimes in Canada you have this weird thing, and probably in the US too, where the Indigenous people are like the ghosts or something, and you know, like the disappearing Indian sort of trope, and that can be done now. We can be done with that, because clearly they're still here, and thank God. But there are a lot of unsettling things about being a settler on somebody else's land, and so there are a certain number of mental gymnastics that people throughout the last several hundred years have had to arrange for themselves to make themselves feel like they belong here. Now I feel like I belong here, but I also can recognize that it's not the way my ancestors behaved coming here, as though they already owned the place, was not so great. And so some of the original tropes, and maybe I'll put a few quotes that I really liked from these books down below. Indigenous authors are starting to turn them on their heads and talk about how, well, okay, like, if it's their land, and these, like the Sasquatch, if you take the Sasquatch as a terrifying monster that might make an appearance, in a wilderness Gothic sort of book, that's not scary in the same way for Indigenous people of the West Coast as it is for settlers. And so the Indigenous people have a different set of fears that mostly have to do with being massacred by settlers and our government and military and the RCMP. And the RCMP is the Canadian National Police. I guess like the National Guard would be kind of the equivalent in the US, or the FBI. Anyway, they have a different set of things that unsettle them. And it's really interesting to see a genre like this turn on its head. It's sort of like reading dystopian fiction by Indigenous authors because they've lived through their apocalypse already and are now on the rebuilding side of it. So anyway, that was a long-winded way of saying there's this book, Monkey Beach. Monkey Beach is a place in, I don't know if it's a fictional place or not, on the west coast of BC, where the Haisla, I think it's a Haisla community, live. And it's famed for Sasquatch sightings. And so there is sort of this fear of nature spirits, interacting with nature spirits, a spellbinding voyage into the long, cool shadows of BC's coast mountains. One of the reasons I haven't read it is because it is a teen novel. Most of the characters are teenagers. But it blends that with Haisla lore, nature spirits, and human tenderness into a multi-layered story of loss and redemption. So I may finally get to this one. It is also available as an audiobook, which is great. Also, if you ever have a chance to see Eden Robinson in a reading event, she's hilarious. I've never in my life met somebody who laughs so much or so enthusiastically. The next one, in that same vein of Res Gothic or Indigenous Gothic, is Kiss of the Fur Queen by Tomson Highway. I'm not going to talk at such length about all these, or we'll be here for 3 days. But this is described as beautiful, lyrical, emotionally complex, witty, symphonic, and sad. Okay. There are a couple of brothers torn from their magical life in northern Manitoba and thrust into the hostile world of a Catholic residential school. Their language is forbidden, their names are changed, both boys are abused. And yet wherever they go, the wily shape-shifting Fur Queen watches over them. So there's a shape-shifting figure in this, and apparently in both this and Monkey Beach, both of these books figure in some Gothic books by academics about Gothic literature in Canada. So they're both studied quite a lot in that regard. One book that I've heard is Gothic, but I don't know if it is Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. Ever creepy and love-flowing like beer at a bush party. It's a book about dreams, home, and family, etc., etc. Explores the permeable boundaries of dreams, reality, and culture. So I've heard it's horror, I've heard it's Gothic. I'm not entirely sure what it is. I'm fine with uncategorizable as well. But I do want to read this one at some point. So maybe this month, next month, whatever month, one of the months. Moon of the Crusted Snow is an amazing atmospheric book, and I can totally see how it's a bit Gothic. It does have that very eerie atmospheric feeling. Ugh, it's incredible. I love it. So I have got the French version. Now I am still reading Madame Bovary and the Two Towers in French, so it remains to be seen if I'll get to this at once, because 3 French books for me at once might be way too overwhelming, because I am so slow at reading French. I'm still learning, and so I really only read books right now that I've, usually with the exception of Madame Bovary, that I've read before in English, because I know the story and it's a little less intimidating that way. And also this is just, it's an astonishingly beautiful book. I love it. He's got a sequel. It's got a lot of Anishinaabe in it, which is so cool. Yeah, I love it. All right, and then the last one that I think might fall into this category is this very thin little An Anthology of Monsters, How Story Saves Us from Our Anxiety. This is actually a nonfiction lecture series by Cherie Dimaline. And because she has dealt with anxiety forever, as far as I know, and has used stories, and she's written things that are, if not Gothic, certainly sci-fi fantasy. There's genre fiction, elements of horror, although I don't think she's ever written anything that's like out and out horror, but certainly elements of. So this is about how the stories we tell ourselves help reshape the ways in which we think, cope, and ultimately survive. So that'll be cool. All right, so the next sort of subcategory of contemporary that I'm doing is, apparently I'm gonna need to record this in little segments with coughing breaks because this cold just won't give up. But anyway, and I probably won't bother putting in all the little icons of audiobooks that I usually do because there are so many. I'll just list them down below if you're interested. But one of the ones that fits into either, it's been called Tropical Gothic or Latin American Gothic, that's like a subcategory of contemporary, is The Dangers of... That worked really well. Good. Okay. The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez. And she's from Argentina. I've read one other book of hers that I really enjoyed. So I've got this as an audiobook. And here's hoping I like it just as much. And so these two are also going to be part of my Read Around the World challenge that I'm working on. Hoping for 75-ish% by the end of the year. This is Human Sacrifices by Fernanda Ampuero, and she is from Ecuador. And this is a collection of short stories excuse me, that plow right through the wound of having a body, of being a woman, of remaining against all odds alive. She confronts machismo, inequity, and violence in her latest short story collection. Tropical Gothic is how it's described at the back. She considers the decay and oppression beneath the surface of our humid and hostile world. So, yeah, that sounds fun. Another one in sort of the same vein is Fresh Dirt from the Grave by Giovanna Rivero. She is from Bolivia. And this says Shipwrecks, Spirits, Mystical Rituals, and Medical Trials. This is where contemporary horrors and ancient terrors meet. So yeah, I'm into it. The supernatural Bolivian Gothic has an extraordinary cult narrator. So those are the three that I want to read that'll do double duty for Read Around the World and Gothlit November, which will be fun. Okay. So the next section is American Gothic. Excuse me, sorry. And some of these are Southern Gothic. So I read Beloved already because the audiobook came in at the library. And so sometimes my holds at the library determine my reading schedule because what can you do? Anyway, I reread Beloved. It is a masterpiece, and oh my god, it's astonishingly good. So I'm also going to reread, and then this may or may not happen in November, Sula, which is the other of Morrison's books that have been described as Gothic. So this traces the lives of two black heroines from their close-knit childhood in a small Ohio town. How Ohio is considered Southern has always been mystifying to me, but sure. Through their sharply divergent paths of womanhood to their ultimate confrontation and reconciliation. So I read this years and years and years ago. I'm not entirely sure what's Gothic about it, but I'll find out. Because apparently some people at least think that it has at least Gothic elements. And Beloved certainly does have Gothic elements. It's, oh god, I love that book. Okay. So the next few are audiobooks that I've been stockpiling, either from my library or Audible or wherever. One is The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson, and then there's a book of Dark Tales by Shirley Jackson. So I really want to read both those two because I liked The Haunting of Hill House. I loved We Have Always Lived in the Castle. So I do want to read some of her short stories. There are also some short stories called The Ghost Stories of Edith Wharton. What did I read by Edith Wharton? It was one of those period books in New York, high society, something or other. Didn't do a thing for me. Not interested. Ghost stories. Okay, I'll try. And then I want to read, where did it go here? Flowers in the Attic. So I've never read anything by V.C. Andrews. She is very prolific. She's got a gazillion novels, more than 80. Which is wild. So, you know, if you find an author you like and they've got 80 books, I guess you're set for a while. This says, so there's a family and the kids are kept, I think, in the attic of their grandmother's mansion. Or the top floor. Their loving mother assures them it will just be for a little while. Their survival is at the mercy of their cruel and superstitious grandmother, and their cramped and helpless world may be the only one they ever know. Sounds weird. Psychological suspense. Apparently it's a family saga. There are more in this series, so if I like it, I could keep reading, but I don't know. We'll see. I'll start with this one and see what I think. And then I want to read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. So I did read, what was the other book I already read by T. Kingfisher? A House with Good Bones. That was fun. That came in at the library as an audiobook as well, so, you know. And that was the first book by her I'd ever read. But her writing style was really just fun and sarcastic and funny and weird. And so I liked it. I like that one. So I'll try this one as well. And then I want to also try The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. I know less about this one. I've got a hold on it at the library, so, you know, it might come in like February or something. Who knows? Then there's a book that I've ordered that is not here yet, called When Things Get Dark, Short Stories Inspired by Shirley Jackson, edited by Ellen Dadlow. She does a lot of short story collections that she edits a lot of them on all sorts of different horror related themes, and this one is inspired by Shirley Jackson, so I thought, sure, why not? It's contemporary writers. If I like some of the stories, a lot of them have novels they've written or other short stories that I can check out, so that'll be fun. And then this one is, I think, actually a memoir, but it's also been described as Gothic sometimes. This is In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. She has written horror stories. The front says, Machado doesn't contain our terror, she strokes it and teaches us about it. So it's a memoir, but it's a haunted house memoir with apparently Gothic elements. So, yeah, I don't know. But it's been on my TBR for, when did it come out? Fair ways ago now. 2019. So it's been on my list since 2019. Might as well get to it soon then. Okay, then I've got a bunch of Edgar Allan Poe. Does he count as Southern Gothic? Or because he's not contemporary Gothic, but he's not Southern. He's like American East Coast Gothic at the same time as Southern Gothic. I don't know what you call that. At any rate, I've got The Fall of the House of Usher and Other Stories, which I love the cover of this book. Anyway, it's got poetry in here, it's got short stories, it's got all sorts of poems, tales, essays, and reviews, is what the subtitle says. So that'll be fun. And then, because that wasn't enough, I have the Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which I read this like 15 years ago, something like that. And what was that? Sorry, I got distracted. Oh, a Poe timeline. There's a Poe timeline in the middle of the book. That's what I got distracted by. Anyway, I read this a million years ago in university, in my undergrad, and loved it, but I can't remember anything about it because my memory is abysmal. So I'm going to reread it. And then I have just poems by Edgar Allan Poe. Is this all of them? Yeah, complete poems. So we'll see how many of those I get through. Might not be all of them. And then, oh yeah, so I have the great short works of Herman Melville. And you may be, not unreasonably, wondering why on earth this would be on a list of Gothic literature. Well, that is because he's got a short story called Benito Carreno, which I think is set on a ship. I don't know, he writes a lot of books at sea. That is Gothic. He's got a Gothic short story. Most of his short stories are not Gothic. They're just, I don't know, naturalistic, whatever the correct English lit description is. Oh, Billy Budd Sailor's in here. I gotta read that one eventually. Anyway, that may be the only short story I read in November because my list is outrageous and unmanageable. But I love Moby Dick so much. I've read it twice now. I will read it again one day. It is gorgeous. The language is so, it's incredible. Anyway, I haven't read his short stories yet, so I should do that. I'll read at least this one during November, and then we'll see about when I eventually get to everything else. And then I got The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. I've never read anything by her before, but these are based on fairy tales and legends that she's turned into dark, sensual, fantastic stories. And I've heard some of them described as Gothic. Some described as horror. There's a lot of overlap between Gothic and Gothic horror, and yeah, so for some of these, like this one and Mikado's book and Bad Cree, they're books that it remains to be seen once I read them whether I'll describe them as Gothic, but at least some people have. Okay, so that's the end of the American section. Next is the British section. So these are classic Gothic, some of them. I really want to reread Wuthering Heights because I reread Jane Eyre last year for Gothlit November, and it's been such a long time since I've read Wuthering Heights. But when I last read it, I absolutely loved it so much. I want to read The King's General by Daphne du Maurier. This is, it's another one of these books that I don't know if I'll describe it as Gothic in the end, but people have. But it's a historical fiction set during the Civil War in England. And it says she can conjure up tragedy, tension, suspense, the ridiculous, the vain, the romantic. So 15 years later, war forces on her to shelter with relatives at an estate, etc., etc. Somebody storms back into her life, conflicting emotions, dark secret at Menabili. Yeah, so, you know, secrets, manor house, could be Gothic? I don't know, remains to be seen. But I do want to read more Daphne du Maurier because she's fun, and I loved Rebecca. Then I want to read Gothic. So Arthur Conan Doyle has written a collection of short stories called Gothic Tales. I didn't know that. Gotta read that. I have listened to every single Sherlock Holmes story that was so on Audible, Stephen Fry narrates all of the entire Sherlock Holmes collection, which is like 40 or 50 hours worth of story. It's a lot. It's really a lot, but it's magnificent, and I love it. And then I read The Lost World, which was also really interesting. A little bit racist, but the premise was interesting. So we'll see about the Gothic Tales. Could be fun. And then I want to read Nevermore and Fragile Things by Neil Gaiman. I have this very pretty hardcover of, I assume it used to have a dust jacket at one point, but it's secondhand, so it doesn't now. But this is Fragile Things, Short Fictions and Wonders. So at least some of these are said to be Gothic, and then Nevermore is said to be Gothic. So we'll see. But yeah, it's a collection of short stories. Oh yeah, Oh Caledonia. I can't remember now if it was Rachel or Bailey who read this last year for Gothlit November, but I think it was one of them. and really liked it, so I want to read that one this year. And then I might read The Woman in Black. There's a mystery theater in the city where I live that's doing the play Woman in Black, which I'm slightly tempted by, but we'll see. But I figure I probably should read that someday. But that's one of those ones where, like, if I don't get to it this November, someday. It'll be a someday book. Then I got this. So this is a contemporary British one. So some of those others were... Neil Gaiman is contemporary. I don't know about Elspeth Barker. So yeah, now we're into contemporary British Gothic. This is Pine by Francine Toon. I heard about this on Instagram. The Guardian calls it a literary Gothic thriller to chill the marrow. It is set in a small village in the Highlands, surrounded by forest, when a woman stumbles onto the road one Halloween night. Yeah. Forest in the fall in the Highlands of Scotland. I'm good with that. She brilliantly captures the wildness of rural childhood and the intensity of small town claustrophobia, uniting the chill of a modern Gothic with the pulse of a thriller. So I'm gonna give that a go because that sounds amazing. And then I've got Slade House by David Mitchell. This has been on my shelf for I don't know how many years, a zillion. It's called A Ripping Yarn, sure. Like Shirley Jackson's Hill House or the Overlook Hotel from Stephen King's The Shining, Slade House is a thin sliver of hell designed to entrap the unwary. It sounds fairly Gothic. The Shining has also been considered Gothic, but I'm a little scared of Stephen King because I read some short stories years ago and was a bit too creeped out by them, so we'll see if I ever read that one. I don't know, maybe. Anyway, then the last of the sort of British, well, this is, I think, a combination of British, American, and random other things, but this is Horror Stories Classic Tales from Hoffman to Hodgson's. I've started reading this. I'm about a quarter of the way through, and it's really fun so far, but classic horror stories and modern horror stories are two very different things. Like, you can sort of see how one leads into the other, but the way they used to be written, the pacing is so totally different. But this has Edgar Allan Poe and Sheridan Le Fanu, but it also has Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Charles Dickens, Emile Zola, Robert Louis Stevenson, Rudyard Kipling. This has Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. I do like that story a lot. Bram Stoker, who wrote a short story with the title of A Racial Slur, apparently. Great. W.W. Jacobs, The Monkey's Paw. That's a really good one. It's very sad, a little creepy. Yeah, so I'll continue reading that one. This might be a sort of meander through this book throughout the whole of winter situation, but I'm fine with that. And then there's one, well, aside from Emile Zola in that book, which has been translated to English, there's one French author who has written, so Théophile Gautier has written a book of, these are older ones, these are like, this would fit into Victorian, I think, except French. What do you call that? I don't know what that's called. Anyway, La Morte Amoureuse, The Dead Lover, is one of the short stories in here that is apparently quite Gothic. So, sort of like with Melville, I may just read that one short story this time. Also because the whole thing is in French and I'm overwhelmed with the other French books that are on my list at the moment. So, I may just read this little, how long is this? Oh, it's not too bad. 112. Yeah, it's about 30 pages long. I can cope with that. It'll be fine. So that's the, I don't know, Victorian French Gothic. Okay, so then within contemporary Gothic, this is definitely in contemporary Gothic, there's this sort of new Gothic subgenre called the Eco-Gothic, which I'm really interested in. I haven't read a lot, but I'm interested. So one of them is The Earth Strikes Back. This is an anthology of ecological horror. Some of them have been described as Gothic, some more as horror. So, after billions of years, our planet is facing a slew of deadly challenges. She is struggling for survival. It's only a matter of time before the Earth strikes back. Mother Earth has been suffering at the hands of her children. Acid rain, toxic waste, polluted air, poisoned water, depleted ozone, etc. Are only the most obvious signs of mankind's ingratitude to the planet. So there are 20 different short story writers in here. Yeah, about the Earth striking back, apparently. And I don't know most of these writers. This was published in, it's been a while now. It's not a new book, surprisingly. It was published in, can I find a date? 1994. So yeah, really not, what is that, like 30 years ago? Jeez. So not new. Do I know any? Oh yeah, Poppy Z. Bright I've heard of. But I haven't heard of most of these authors before, so that's that. This is out of print, so it's a tiny bit hard to find. I found it on eBay. But it took a while to find a copy that wasn't stupid expensive. But these ones are more recent. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure my pile of books doesn't go like spilling onto the floor here. So, Evil Roots, which I know is on Bailey's list too. Killer Tales of the Botanical Gothic. Yes, please. Strangling vines and meat-hungry flora fill this unruly garden of strange stories, selected for their significance as the seeds of the villainous, or perhaps just misunderstood, killer plant in fiction, film, and video games. So some of them are by classic authors, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman and H.G. Wells. But some of them I think are more recent. And there's, how many? 15? Somewhere between 15 and 20 short stories in here. And then this, I don't know if this is Gothic. It might be more horror, but it could be the sort of wilderness Gothic that you do get in Canada sometimes, because it's so darn cold and wildernessy here for most of the year. This is in the same series. It's called Polar Horrors, Strange Tales from the World's Ends. So the Arctic and the Antarctic. As I moved with stiff legs along the reefs, I slipped into the water. It was cold beyond belief, the very quintessence of deathly Arctic ice, so cold that it seemed to sear and bleach the skin. I have experience with that sort of cold. Up in Canada, it does get that. Like, I'm not in the Arctic Circle, not even close, but it's still, winter gets impressive. So this features tales rife with aliens, twisted science, and madness, spanning 1837 to 1946. Enduring lure of these sublime and uncanny spaces at the ends of the earth. So it might not be, it's another one of these collections that like might have Gothic elements, it might not, it might just be horror. I might read it in December or something. But this whole series of the British Library Tales of the Weird is actually pretty cool. There are tons in this series, and these were just the two that jumped out to me the most. Okay, so those are the fiction books on my list. Now, because I am a geek, I have some nonfiction on my list as well. So I'm going to show you those too, because of course I am. All right, the first one is the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction. 14 world-class experts on the Gothic provide thorough accounts of this haunting to horrifying genre from the 1760s to the end of the 20th century. Yeah, so I read one of these books on, what was it on that I already read? Now it's gone out of my head. I can't remember. I have one on Virginia Woolf. Not Virginia Woolf. Do I have one on Virginia Woolf? If I don't, it's on my list to get someday. I have one about the Brontes, which I'll get to in a second. And I have one about Ulysses, which is obviously not Gothic. But I got this one because this whole series sounds so cool. If the books weren't $40 each, I would have many more of them. Um, so there's there are a bunch that go through sort of the beginnings of Gothic, French and German Gothic, the beginnings, that would be cool. Irish and Scottish Gothic, and then of course the Victorian Gothic, American Gothic, British Gothic fiction, Gothic on screen, colonial and post-colonial Gothic in the Caribbean, that sounds cool, and the contemporary Gothic and after Gothic. So that sounds fun. So if that doesn't sound fun to you, you may just skip the next section because it's all going to be like that. So then I've got Eco-Gothic. This book will provide the first study of how the Gothic engages with eco-critical ideas, exploring images of environmental catastrophe, the wilderness, the idea of home, constructions of nature, and images of the post-apocalypse, which is pretty interesting. Also because in a lot of Canadian Gothic, like, you know, in British and American Gothic, Southern Gothic in particular, there's like a big manor house, and that's the main setting for a lot of Gothic. In Canada, the wilderness often takes the place of the manor for the eerie setting. And so Eco-Gothic is really interesting to me for that, among other reasons. Then I've got, so these two are new. There seems to be a new series from Anthem Press. These might be the only ones out yet, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, I'll definitely have to look into it, because if there are more in this series, I'm gonna get them. Because this one is Nordic Terrors, Scandinavian Superstition in British Gothic Literature. And this one is Gothic Appalachian Literature. And so they're both really slim. And they're both by academics, so I don't know how. A lot of these books that I'm talking about are by academics, so I don't know how like accessible for people who don't like reading academic books they'll be. But I think at least the premise is pretty interesting. And then I've got two that are about Gothic, making sure my stuff doesn't fall over again, Gothic bodies. So this is the Gothic body, Sexuality, Materialism, and Degeneration at the Fin de Siècle. So the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. And so the author explores a key scenario that haunts the genre, the loss of a unified and stable human identity and the emergence of a chaotic, transformative, abhuman identity in its place. Cool. Strongly indebted to 19th century biology and social medicine, evolutionism, criminal anthropology, and degeneration theory. That sounds interesting to me. This one, I also got, most of these I got secondhand. This is Gothic Bodies, The Politics of Pain in Romantic Fiction. So it is from the University of Pennsylvania. And the sections are politics, pain, politics, and the romantic sensibility, imagining pain, spectacular pain, politics and the romantic theater intermezzo, the epistemology of the tortured body, anesthetics and anesthetics at the Revolution. So this seems more academic than other ones, but still sounds kind of interesting. I'm definitely not going to get through all of these books, like, because the academic ones will take a little bit longer to read than the fiction ones, so not going to get through all of those in November for sure, but still I'm glad I've got them. This one is The Gothic, Post-Colonialism and Otherness, Ghosts from Elsewhere. And this is somebody who's from India exploring, re-examining the role of race in the role of the colonial and racial other in the mainstream Gothic colonial fiction. This book goes on to engage with problems of narrating the subaltern in the post-colonial context. Because usually you've got like an other that's frightening, whether that's like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation where the other is part of yourself, or it's actually some other like Frankenstein. You've got something that's frightening that's other. And sometimes, like in Wuthering Heights, you've got the other as the Creole woman in the attic. And so this does look at Emily Bronte and Jane Reese and Conrad Kipling Melville and Erna Brodber. I don't know who that is. But yeah, that'll be an interesting sort of different perspective on things. I've also ordered a few other books that I'll list below. One is the Russian Gothic, which sounds cool, like Russian, because Russian literature is very Russian to begin with. Like, it's a lot of it, because I've read Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, and they get dark and they get weird. And so to have a Gothic Russian just sounds like, I'm trying and failing to imagine what that would be, but I'm interested to read about it. Then I've ordered Suicide in the Gothic, Canadian Gothic Literature History of this, sorry, I muddled that title. Canadian Gothic Literature, History, and the Spectre of Self-Invention. And then The Haunted Wilderness, the Gothic and Grotesque in Canadian Fiction. So those are coming. I don't know when they'll come. They might come in like January, because I've ordered some of them. Like the Canadian one is published. The Canadian Gothic, I think, is published by University of Wales or something. So it's coming from overseas. I don't know. Then I'm gonna read The Mad Woman in the Attic, because I think it was Rachel who read this last year. And it's a brick. So it's not short, but it talks about the woman writer and the 19th century literary imagination. Called A Feminist Classic, this path-breaking book of literary criticism sets the groundwork, pardon me, for the subsequent generations of scholarly writing about women writers. What else? I really need them to start putting synopses again on the back of a book instead of just blurbs. Anyway, it's got Towards a Feminist Poetics, Inside the House of Fiction, Jane Austen's Tenets of Possibility. I'm not a huge Jane Austen fan. Apologies to all the Jane Austen fans out there. How Are We Fallen, Milton's Daughters, The Spectre, Selves of Charlotte Bronte. That sounds fun. Captivity and Consciousness in George Eliot's fiction. Also into that. And then Strength in Agony, 19th Century Poetry by Women. Emily Dickinson is mentioned there. So, yeah, I don't know. That might take a while, but I'll get through it eventually. And then, I am getting nearish the end of the list. I have the Cambridge Companion to the Brontes, because of course I do. I've read several biographies of them, and this has a couple of sections written by people like Julia Barker, who's written one of those biographies, and I'm just endlessly fascinated by them. So yeah, that's up. And then, oh, this one I started to read. It's extremely academic language, so it's going to take me a while. This is The Powers of Horror, an essay on objection by Julia Kristeva. I'm only on page 38, so yeah, I've got a ways to go. It's very interesting, and the academic writing doesn't feel like unnecessarily academic. It feels like she's a philosopher, so she's being precise. But that still means it's going to take me a while to get through. But this book was referenced in 2 other books that I've already read about the Gothic, so I thought, if this is influencing other writers about the Gothic, maybe I should read it. Okay. Then I've got a little poetry section. So this is Writing Poetry in the Dark by Stephanie M. Witovich. There's another book called Writing in the Dark, about writing like horror and stuff. And this is specifically about writing poetry. And I've got somewhere, hang on the subject of blackberries by the same author. This is poetry that won either the Bram Stoker Award or the Shirley Jackson Award, I can't remember. Anyway, it's there are bits of the garden that make their way in here, which I'm a fan of, but there are also meditations on female rage, postpartum depression, compulsion, and intrusive thoughts. It's really interesting. I don't usually like free verse, but the content is really interesting. And then for the same reason, I've gotten this one, Into the Forest and All the Way Through, by Cynthia Paleo, which is poems about missing and murdered women. So, cheerful. subject matter then. Okay, those are all the books on my TBR. There are a couple other books I'll mention that I've pre-read because they came in at the library. One is American Gothic Fiction by Alan Lloyd Smith, and one was Unsettled Remains, Canadian Literature and the Post-Colonial Gothic. Those were both really, really interesting. So I've got some quotes from both of those that I've pulled out that maybe I'll put in the description box below. Is there a word limit in the description box? I don't know. I guess I'll find out. And then I read Gothic Literature by Sue Chaplin. This is actually a university textbook. So it's got sections on history, like a cultural overview, texts, writers, and context, which is just a history, and then critical theories and debates, which was the most interesting part. So narrative and stability in the Gothic narrator, the female Gothic, Gothic bodies, and nation and empire. And this is where it gets dangerous because the bibliography for this is where I got a lot of the ideas for these other books. So, whoops. And then I also read a few. Oh yeah, I read Committed by Susan Skell, and that's not really Gothic, but it does touch on the Mad Woman in the Attic thing. So that was pretty interesting. I read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which is quite Gothic. A House with Good Bones, I mentioned that. The Best Horror of the Year. There are a few volumes in that series that are, at the moment, free on Audible. I say free. Like, they're free if you pay the $15 or whatever a month. So those are not really free, but they're included at the moment. So I listened to that one. And Beloved, and then this is the other one that I've sort of pre-read. Night of the Living Res, Stories by Morgan Talty. This would fit into Res Gothic or Indigenous Gothic. Well, sort of Gothic. Gothic-ish. It's been described as Gothic. I'm not super convinced that I would describe it as Gothic. It might have a couple of Gothic elements, but I don't think it's overall Gothic. It is, however, a very interesting book. Okay, is that everything? That might be finally everything. Sorry this is so long. Oh yeah, there are a couple of articles too that I'll link below that were interesting. One is on the Canadian Gothic. No, two are on the Canadian Gothic. One is an interesting overview of somebody's distinctions between Gothic and horror that I found very interesting, although it is also very debatable and highly debated by academics. And then one is on eco-Gothic. That's just like a WordPress vlog from somebody, but I thought it was pretty interesting. So yeah, that is my entirely impossible November, Gothlit November TBR, but I'll give it a go and see what happens. Anyway, I hope you'll join Bailey and Rachel as well. They're fantastic. I'll link their channels down below. They're super fun and always have interesting books that they're reading, so it'll be fun to see as well what they pick for Gothlit November. Anyway, that's everything for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.